Welcome to the Our Dad Stamps YouTube channel. My name's Pete West, and like a lot of people my age, I started collecting stamps as a child, encouraged by my father, who was an avid collector. 20 years ago I inherited his collection, and at the same time I also inherited my wife's dad's collection. Since then I've been buying and selling stamps through my online stores at Delcamp and eBay under the name Our Dad Stamps. And this has allowed me to grow the collection into what you see behind me. With these videos, I want to share some stories and information that I've learnt about stamps and stamp collecting. I hope you enjoy them, and if you do, don't forget to click on the like button and subscribe to get regular updates on new content. Hello again from Our Dad Stamps. Following my recent podcast on the Penny Red, I've had a request from a Matthew Jeffrey. So thank you very much for that, Matthew. And he's asked that if I could do a podcast about the Tuppeny Blue. So this is it. However, with the Tuppeny Blue, there isn't anywhere near as much detail as there is with the Penny Red. So what I thought I would do is to do a podcast about the Tuppeny Blue, but also include all the other early Victorian Great Britain stamps. It's actually one of my favourite areas for collecting. There are so many varieties and different areas to collect that for me it makes it one of the most interesting areas of stamp collecting. For example, there's an endless variety of watermarks that we used during this period, and we're talking from the introduction of the penny black in 1840 up to about 1880. When things started to get a bit more organised. But in the early days of Victorian stamps, certainly in Great Britain, there was no real plan, there was no organisation as such. It was a case of when the rates changed and a new stamp was needed, they produced a new stamp. There was no uniformity of design, there was no uniformity of date or anything, it was completely ad hoc. And I think that adds to the interest. So with the sorts of things you can look at, there is an endless variety of watermarks that we used, depending on the printer that was used at the time and what paper they had. There was also a conscious effort within the British Postal Service to stamp down on fraud and forgeries. This brought about the introduction of letters in the four corners. These check letters made it more difficult to reproduce a stamp, in that each stamp on one sheet had a different letter in the corners. So if you were going to reproduce a stamp, you'd either have to make 240 reproductions, or you would flood the market with a load of stamps with the same check letters, which would be pretty obvious. So firstly, there were no check letters in the corners. Then they used small check letters in all four corners, which were white on a coloured background. They later changed this to having large check letters, again, white letters with a coloured background. And finally, they swapped it around and had coloured letters on a white background. So all these are prevalent within the different stamps that came out in the early Victorian period. And on top of that, they started printing plate numbers in the stamps. So that's yet another area. As I said before, it gives you a vast array of possibilities to collect. And it's one I've certainly got my teeth into, and I've actually got a whole album just on Victorian Great Britain stamps. If you look at the catalogue value in Stanley Gibbons, or for that matter in any of the other major catalogues, it would appear you'd need to be super rich to get that sort of collection. But that's not actually the case. The catalogue value is for a top of the range, nicely centred and clearly postmarked stamp. And these are quite hard to come by. But if you don't mind one that's off centre, that maybe has a couple of pulled perfs on it, that's been heavily cancelled, or is just generally grubby, you can pick up a lot of the Victorian stamps for less than a tenner. So it's not beyond the realms of the average collector. So let's have a look at what there is available for you and what you can start to collect. I should add at this point that I'm not going to go into the embossed stamps. They are hugely expensive and not a huge amount of variety with them. And to be honest, it's not an area I know much about, and I certainly don't have any embossed stamps. So I'm going to give that one a miss for the time being, but maybe I'll come back to that later. So since it was requested, I'm going to start with the Tuppeny Blues. And as most of you will know, the Tuppeny Blue was issued at the same time as the Penny Black, and it used exactly the same design as the Penny Black, except that along the bottom it had twopence as opposed to 1 penny, and the colour was blue instead of black. And other than that, it was the same as the Penny Black. It was produced imperforate, so the clerk at the post office had to cut each stamp out individually. But unlike the Penny Black, only 2 plates were used, known as plate 1 and plate 2. They are fairly easy to distinguish once you've done a bit of study. Like the Penny Blacks, if you study and read up about the differences, they are fairly easy to distinguish between. But with the Tuppeny Blues, you don't even need to go into all the check letters. There are distinct differences between the borders and the stars in the corners that make it easy to distinguish, or relatively easy to distinguish, between plates 1 and 2. A year after the Tuppeny Blue was first issued, around about the time that they changed from a Penny Black to a Penny Red, they decided to change the ink used. They'd done a lot of experiments on the Penny Red and come up with a new type of ink and decided that that should be used for the Tuppeny Blues. And in order to distinguish these new stamps from the old stamps, they drew a line underneath the word postage and above the word twopence. So you now get a Tuppeny Blue with 2 white lines. And once again, these use 2 different plates, known as plate 3 and plate 4. And once again, they are reasonably easy to distinguish from plate characteristics rather than needing to go into the check letters. So we have imperforate plates 1 and 2 with no white lines, and imperforate plates 3 and 4 with white lines. That gives you 4 different varieties to collect. After the perforation trials in the late 1840s, early 1850s, the Tuppeny Blue became perforated. And this is where it gets interesting, because they continued with plate 4 to start with, and you can get plate 4 with a 16 perforation and with a 14 perforation. They then also introduced 2 more plates, plate 5, plate 6, which used a slightly different alphabet. And once again, with some research, you should be able to distinguish between plates 4 and 5. And the other thing with plate 5 is they changed the watermark as well. So you can get plate 5 with a small crown in perf 14 and perf 15, and also with a large crown in perf 14 and perf 16. They also produced a further plate 6, which came with a large crown watermark and again in perf 14 and perf 16. So already we have 12 different varieties of the Tuppeny Blue to collect. In 1858, when they decided to redesign all the stamps and put check letters in all 4 corners, they also used the system which they had on the Penny Red, where they included the plate number in the lattice work on both sides of the stamp. And with that type of Tuppeny Blue, you get plates from 7 up to plate 15, although plates 10 and 11 weren't used as they were deemed not good enough for use. There we go with the Tuppeny Blue. That's 19 different varieties of Tuppeny Blue all told. And if you really want to be specialist, there is actually 2 types of large crown watermark on the plate 9 for some reason. So you could get the 20 different types of Tuppeny Blue. And as I said before, reasonably affordable. The first couple, the imperf plates 1 and 2 that came out when the Penny Black came out, are quite expensive, and they are the most difficult ones to get hold of. But all the others are reasonably affordable, and certainly if you look around, you can probably pick most of them up for around about a tenner, maybe a little bit more in some cases, but certainly affordable anyway. So moving on from the Tuppeny Blue now, when most people start sorting stamps and putting them into a collection, like me, I suspect they're sorted by country and then in chronological order. And that makes perfect sense for most stamps, and that's how you will find most catalogues laid out as well. But with the early Victorian British stamps, this is not necessarily the best thing. And if you buy the Stanley Gibbons Victorious Specialist album, they actually approach it in a different manner. And it is one I have adopted for my collection. And that is collected by value. So apart from the Penny Black and the Tuppeny Blue, which were obviously the first couple of stamps and are the only imperforate stamps, from then on, I've collected by value. So we're going to have a look at the rest of the Victorian stamps in value order. The lowest value Victorian stamp, and we're talking pre-1880 here, because after that things became a little bit more organised. But initially the lowest value Victorian stamp was the halfpenny, known as the Bantam. And this is quite an unusual stamp in that it is half the size of the Penny Black. So it is quite a small stamp. And this was only produced in one design, and it was at the time when check letters were produced in each corner, and the plate numbers were printed in the lattice work on the side of the stamps. Now the halfpenny stamp was printed with plates 1 to plate 20, but not all plates were used, so it's not possible to get hold of some of them. The ones issued are plates 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 19 and 20. And all of these are valued at round about the same. The Stanley Gibbons catalogue value is about £20. But as I've said before, if you're happy to accept one that's not perfect, you can pick these up for just a few pounds. However, plate 9 is slightly different. Plate 9 is valued at £850. So if you get the chance to acquire a plate 9, then it's well worth it. Don't get it mixed up with plate 6 though. The plate numbers are read from the inside of the stamp outwards, not the other way round, so look out for the plate 9 of the halfpenny. Since we've already covered the penny stamps, the next one was the penny halfpenny, or 3 halfpence as it was known at the time. This was produced only using 2 plates, plate 1 and plate 3. Plate 2 was unusable. And again, this has got check letters in all 4 corners and the plate number printed in the side of the stamp. Those 2 stamps are fairly straightforward and not a lot of variety involved in those. Sticking purely in terms of value, the next one, since again we've already covered the Tuppeny stamp, is a Tuppence halfpenny one. Now that didn't actually come out until about 1875. But as I said before, to me it makes more sense to go through this in order of value rather than in order of date. So the Tuppeny halfpenny started in a colour called rosy mauve, which is a sort of pinky colour. And by the time these stamps were being printed, the plate number is clearly visible in a box or in a circle on the stamp. The Tuppeny halfpenny stamp was printed from plates 1 to plate 23. But at plate 17 they did have a colour change from the rosy mauve to a blue. So you can collect plate 17 in the rosy mauve pink colour, but also in the blue colour. There was also a change of watermark at some point as well. Plates 1, 2 and 3 started life with an anchor watermark, and then during the production of plate 3 the watermark changed to an orb. So plate 3 you can have in 2 different watermarks as well. And then by the time you get to plate 21 in the blue, the watermark changed to crown. So you've got 3 different watermarks, you've got 23 different plate numbers, and you've got 2 different colours, just in one stamp. The next stamp in terms of value is the Throttle stamp, which was produced in pink, or rose as it is termed. And once again, it remained a constant design throughout its entire life, but totally different from any other stamps that were issued at the same time. And also there were several different plate numbers used. With the Throttle stamp that was started life in 1860, the first couple of plates weren't printed on the stamp. However, you can tell which plate it is simply by the fact that there isn't a plate number and there is slight differences between plate 2 and plate 3. So pretty easy to spot. Then they started putting plate numbers into them, and as I've said before, they're easy to spot. They're either in a circle or a square at some place on the side of the stamp. And as I said at the beginning, the Throttle Rose, you've got small letters in the corners, you've got large letters in the corners, and you've got large coloured letters in the corners, as well as several different watermarks and different plate numbers, which go from plate 2 up to plate 21. Again, loads of varieties to collect. Moving on, the next value is the fourpenny stamp. And the fourpenny stamp starts to get a little bit more interesting. Again, it was first produced in 1855, and this was to prepay stamps to France. And the first colour was in carmine. And because it was produced in 55, initially the plate numbers were not printed on the stamp. So you need to do a little bit of investigating to find which one's which. But once again, there are characteristics that make it fairly easy to distinguish between the plate numbers. And there's plate 1 and 2, which are in rose carmine. Then they changed the colour to red for plates 3 and 4. Plates 5 and 6 were not used for some reason or other. And then from plate 7 onwards, the plate numbers were clearly printed on the stamp. And the colour was changed to vermilion. And for that, you've got plate 7 up to plate 15. And then plate 15, they changed the colour from vermilion to sage green. Printed plate 15 and 16 in sage green. And then changed it again to grey brown. And printed plates 17, 18 in grey brown. So as well as having the different watermarks, the different size check letters, you've also got 3 different colours. There were no 5-penny stamps issued, so the next value is sixpence, which was first issued in 1856, and so the initial ones don't have plate numbers on them. But again, they're fairly easy to distinguish. And you've got plate 1 with no corner letters. You've got plate 3 with small corner letters. And plate 4 also with small corner letters. Then they changed to the larger corner letters where you've got plates 5 and 6. They then changed the watermark from emblems to spray, and you've got plate 6. Plate 7 wasn't used, plate 8, plate 9, and plate 10, although plate 10 was never actually issued. However, some have found themselves into the public domain. Then after that, in 1872, the design was changed and the colour was changed and the watermark was changed. And you get the sixpence in chestnut and in buff with plates 11 and 12. Finally, it was changed again to grey, where you've got plates 12 to 17. And once again, throughout this whole time, the corner letters were changed from small corner letters to large white corner letters to large coloured corner letters. Loads of variety on the sixpence as well. Quickly finishing off, there was an 8-penny stamp produced in 1876, and there was only one type of these, so there's not a huge amount to collect, unless you're lucky enough to find the purple-brown copy, which was never issued, but several of them have appeared in the public domain. But generally it's plate 1, 8-penny orange is the one you can get. With the 9-penny stamp, there were a few plate numbers of this variety. From plate 2 to plate 4 were used, and these included the small white check letters, the large white check letters, and 2 different watermarks. A 10-penny stamp was issued in 1867, but again this was only one type of stamp with just one plate number, used plate 1, in a couple of different shades of brown. And the last big variety I want to look at is the 1 shilling stamp. Now, 1 shilling green initially came out in 1856. There were no check letters in the corners, there was no plate number printed on the stamp. However, there is only one of that particular type, so it's easy to work out, and this was obviously plate 1. What is confusing is the next 1 shilling stamp had 4 small check letters in the corners and a plate number inscribed in the stamp. But the plate number says plate 1, and this is actually plate 2. So the stamp that has a 1 on it is plate 2 stamp, which is somewhat confusing. And similarly, the stamp that has a number 2 in it is plate 3. I'm not sure if this was a mistake on the post office's part or whether they didn't think about it, but it is slightly confusing. They then realised what was going on and changed the next one to plate 4, which was actually plate 4. So from then on, it's reasonably easy to tell. And then in 1880, they changed the colour to orange-brown. So you get plate 13 in green and also in orange-brown. And also they changed the watermark. So plate 13 is available in green and brown with a spray watermark, and in brown with a crown watermark. And there's also a plate 14 available in that colour as well. The last one I'm going to include in this roundup is the 2 shilling stamp, and there was really only one produced, a plate 1 stamp in a blue colour. Several shades of blue, but it was just one plate was used. However, in 1880 a 2 shilling brown was issued. This didn't last very long and is quite valuable, so it's going to be difficult to get hold of, but you can get a 2 shilling in blue and a 2 shilling in brown. After that we start going into the high value stamps, and that's a completely different ball game, so I'm going to end the podcast here. I hope you've enjoyed this roundup of early Victorian stamps. Maybe you've taken a bit from it. As I said at the beginning, it's a fascinating area of collecting for me, and there's so much variety and so many different types that you can collect. And despite the look on the catalogue, I assure you it's not hugely expensive. It's not cheap, but it's not hugely expensive, and for me, very rewarding. So once again, thank you for listening to my podcast, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks for Our Dad Stamps podcast. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Don't forget you can visit my online stores at eBay and Delcamp under the name of Our Dad Stamps, where I have over 2,000 items for sale. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Our Dad Stamps podcast.